For our first review, we have the Triforce, a level made for the ZSL video game theme. It's a wonderful recreation of the final battle in A Link to the Past, the iconic Legend of Zelda game for the SNES. While the room's walls are bare, the attention is drawn to the track itself and the surrounding pixel art, which is very nicely made. And I'm actually surprised at how close the colors are to the original, even layering glass it supports to match the more specific shades. And even if this level is fairly high on the object count, there's no frame drops here. This is because I assume the overall density is very spread out, allowing the game's level of detail scaling to take effect and keep your FPS happy. But for some more specific points, let's take a look at the gameplay. At the beginning, there's an intended in a wall ride you can perform, which feels just a bit too difficult for competition. The wall is just barely wider than the Zeepkist wheelbase, the micro adjustments needed to stay on here requires some skill for sure, and it's very much intended to be the main route, shown by the extended checkpoint, and the fact if you don't do it, you will not have enough speed to catch the following down ramp after the jump. Further along, this tight banked section can be a little tricky at high speeds, since any airtime will be quite detrimental. There may be a possibility to enter the start and or end of these turns, but it would be very difficult to pull off cleanly. Anyways, as we've expressed in the past, the need to catch the area of effect of fans to gain the most speed is just unintuitive for those not in the knowing. So the fact there's exactly this situation here definitely affects this level. I think the worst part may be the transition into it, as the shape of this road will suddenly bump you off the track if you wanted to set up on the left. You can also get hit by one of the fan blades if you're unlucky on the timing. There's an arrow shooting through the road just ahead, but if you've set up correctly for maximum fan gain, this shouldn't be much of an issue. The loop, while simple, can be a little blind. As you go around it, the camera looks up to the ceiling, which causes the edge of the road to blend into the background. If this had the same yellow edge that most of the other road pieces have, this wouldn't be a problem. Props for correctly putting a checkpoint on the loop here though. Along with all the checkpoints actually, there's a good amount of them spread throughout the track, which is great for players who like to see their splits. Most of the time, more checkpoints is better, not only to prevent any possible cuts, but to let players be more competitive on your maps as well. One last thing, the false reflection in the floor here is genius. It's the same trick a lot of early games use to give the sense of a reflection, simply duplicating and mirroring the objects beneath a translucent plane. But overall, this track is tricky and fun, with some lovely nostalgic pixel art to go with it. We'll have some comparisons on screen to the original game sprites. One very last thing to say is, even if it's not laggy, this level could have been optimized a lot more. The sprites could have used the pixel wall ride pieces to save on some parts, and the tiles on the floor especially could have been combined into one large pattern instead of placing them individually.
Up next is Zwimpie Circuit DS, yet another track in the ever-increasing catalog of Mario Kart levels Zwimpie and Quick Racer have been making. I think this track looks great. The varied and yet surprisingly simple environments makes this a great drive. It's immersive, but lets the track take center stage. Make no mistake, while this is very easy to complete, I found it to be quite a tough time being fast on it. But that does seem to be the case with any level Quick Racer is involved in. They're a pretty quick racer. You may have seen in the Zeepkist Discord that Quick Racer has been making some lovely looking billboards, so I was happy to see them finally being used in a level here. They really do look great, and fit right in with the theming, while also being a bit of legitimate advertisement for their other levels. Kinda smart actually. And this seems to be a recreation of an actual Mario Kart track. Excuse my lack of knowledge, but from my very quick search, it seems this is based off the DS Mario Circuit remake in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. A remake of a remake. How interesting. But this is still Zeepkist, and I will review it as such, as usual. I have a few complaints to talk about here, mostly about the lack of signage. There is a shortcut through the sand here, and it saves a big chunk of time, about 5 seconds. And while it is a thing in the track this was based off of, for anyone not in the know, I think you can totally miss this. There's nothing that visually describes this as a shortcut, and this fireball really gets in the way of the player's vision. Honestly, without this fireball, I think it would be easier to see the path through. The gap in the rocks would be more tempting in my opinion, but unless you know the track, or just notice the lack of checkpoint on the normal route, I don't see the average player finding this. Moving on, past the tunnel is an arguably blind jump, one that may not even seem like a jump in the first place. If you don't arms up, and there is nothing to tell you here otherwise, you end up with a tiny bit of airtime and your wheels catch the road edge, sending you in a seemingly random direction. After the following turn is another blind jump, this time straight into the banked turn. One of those try something different for the next run type of transitions. But intentional or not, the pole of this sign up ahead is a pretty good guide to line yourself up with, so you're not entirely in the dark with the guesswork. And the final section I actually enjoy quite a bit. It's different in the sense that it uses scaled bank pieces, something not commonly seen. It's the good kind of guesswork, where you see the whole path and you need to figure out the best line for it. Wider and smoother, or straight through and bumpy. But I think that's all I have to say here. I would go over the decoration in detail, but I think this track deserves to be seen while driving it. Overall, I do enjoy this track. It looks great and plays great once you get used to it. The decoration is simple but effective, and really embodies that only decorate what you can see while driving method. And I didn't know where to fit the Yoshi into this review, but it probably works as a good outro. The Summoning. I gotta say, my first thoughts on this track were, it looks great, and it's very blind. Aesthetically, I'm really into this track. The matte color palette along with the simplistic shapes makes for some really smooth looking decoration. But I think this so badly needed some guidance. Even at the very start, I legitimately just went straight forward because I couldn't tell where the track is supposed to go with how shallow the camera angle is. Road borders, poles, or any obstacle work as great guides for the player, and I think one of those could have worked here if you don't necessarily want arrows, which I can understand. Anyways, the track combines off-grid and on-grid transitions fairly seamlessly, but one thing I will mention is the lack of contrast with the skybox. I love the red paint used here, I really do. But there are some spots where it definitely just disappears against the background. It's especially noticeable in the overhead camera shots. But if we want to get into specifics, I'll point out the blind areas. The start, which as mentioned before, has nothing to tell you to turn left. The turn through checkpoint 2, it's unnecessarily blocked by the decoration, and you really need to know of the turn beforehand, or else you just won't make it. And the turn through checkpoint 4 is the exact same, just mirrored. But somehow this one feels even more mean, probably because of this metal lip that I always seem to catch. Stuff like this can be avoided if more care is taken into looking at the visibility of transitions and turns. It may not be an important step for everyone, but I do recommend a quick look at your levels every so often as you're building them, looking from the perspective of the driver especially. Another thing to talk about is this transition to the large quarter pipe. I love seeing the edges defined with a contrast in color, but this extra metal line really made it look like the edges were not lined up. I'll show a comparison here. If that metal line wasn't there, this would be perfect. But moving on, I do want to mention on this transition, the metal lip actually sticks out from the wall a small amount. Now this is a very nitpicky complaint, but it is noticeable as your wheels clack driving over it. And I would be worried about something like this causing some Unity weirdness, but it doesn't seem to be the case here, thankfully. From my experience, it seems like very slight offsets to piece-to-piece transitions are what causes you to catch your wheels on nothing in Unity bounce. I would try to avoid this kind of thing in the future for that exact reason. But overall, I really like the aesthetic of this track. It looks great, even if it's very simply put together at less than 500 pieces. The unique transitions and full-speed nature make it quite fun to play. Other than those blind turns catching you off guard, I could definitely do without those. Next we have Ponth. For some reason I cannot pronounce that. This is a short yet fun track, filled with a few pretty cool transitions. It's definitely unique, and even though that can sometimes be a detriment, I think this level pulls it off quite well. Each transition feels perfectly timed to the next. I don't think I need to ask for any extra breathing room, except maybe the loop. One thing I see a lot is transitions either too close together or too far apart. The flow to a level is fairly important to the overall enjoyment, and finding that balance can make or break it. But this decoration is also really enjoyable. I don't know if it was just luck, but I read this very easily on my first try. Normally, tracks that use the same colors as decoration can worsen the readability, but I never felt that way here, so I'll chalk it up to some sort of magic. But the variance in scale and the decoration, it adds so much to the abstractness of it all. In terms of shape, this is like textbook abstract. The primitive spheres, giant rings, and most of all the pillars, they really give off a similar vibe to that Y2K vaporwave aesthetic, and I love it. But moving on, I do have some things to mention about the gameplay. For one, this transition right before checkpoint 1 can be quite unintuitive. There's quite a few different ways to take it, but pretty much only one that gives you the speed you need. All the time save I had on this level was just from this transition. But along with that, this loop shortly after can be a little confusing. I don't think I'm super into the overlapping of pieces used here, as being on the right side gives you quite the jolt, but it is a short and unique transition. Another way to make something like this would be with the curved quarter pipes, which I think would clean it up quite a bit. Also, I think the camera switch after the loop could have been placed a little further out. It comes up just a little too quickly for my preference. I will say, the arrows are marvelous. I'm happy with all their placements, and they work great. It definitely feels like care was taken into consideration for the signage, and I appreciate it. But I think that's all I have to say here. The track is relatively short after all, but I've went over everything I want to mention. Overall, I really like this track. It's quite fun, looks great, and the colors are beautiful. The unique transitions may make it a little on the unintuitive side for some players, but its short completion time definitely makes up for it.
Next up, we have Deltarune 1, Khord Castle, a continuation of Round's series of Deltarune maps. Yet again, it's another beautiful interpretation of the game's environments. The whole map perfectly encapsulates the vibe of the titular Khord Castle. The theming really is quite something to observe. I love the color palettes especially. The mix of monochrome gray tones with the dark navy blue is a perfect fit that will certainly be familiar to anyone who's played that game. And you may have noticed, but the level also uses zero-scale black walls to further push that 2D feeling from the game. Notably at the start, it truly does feel like you're entering the castle, seeing nothing but the front facade. The subtle parallax keeps it grounded in Zeepkist's 3D environment though, as it may have looked a little awkward if it was fully two-dimensional. Another neat aspect is the doorways between areas of the castle matching the suits of the cards. It's a small thing seen in the game that shows the attention to detail this map was created with. But let's not linger on the decoration for too long, there's gameplay to look at. The track itself is mostly clear in where you need to go next. The use of arrows is well thought out and appreciated. Even between these tight walls, it's surprisingly readable as a track. And while it may not be on the difficult side to finish, it is difficult to get a clean run all the way through. I have to say, it is extremely satisfying if you can manage it. There's one thing I do dislike here though, and that is the ending. It uses invisible blocks to prevent a low jump off the side. There are likely a lot of people who are going to want to try this, and it's a fairly obvious optimization to make and easy too. Personally, I think there are much better ways to prevent something like this instead of using invisible walls, because they can also seem kind of mean, more so at the end of a van. The simplest solution would be to shrink the cylindrical finish so you wouldn't possibly be able to low jump it, but blocking it with some other decoration is another option. Now, if we're being extra nitpicky, there are a few walls that can be frustrating to hit when racing. Specifically the window at checkpoint 2 if you take a wider line, the club door near the end, again if you're taking a wider line, and the spades on the S-bends also at the end. But that may just be my skill issue and not a map problem. As mentioned before, finding and remembering the clean route isn't easy, but once you figure it out, it does feel great, and the unique transitions go from problems to enjoyable racing. Overall, it's a great layout that should be simple to finish, while still providing ample challenge for those who want fast times. That along with the amazing decoration creates a perfect homage to Deltarune, while still looking great in Zeepkist 2.
Now, for our last review, we have King of the Mountain 4, or COT M4 as shown in game. It's a bit of an older level, being made just a bit over a year ago from when this video was posted. Now, we've definitely progressed in standards for levels in the past year or so, but even at a year old, this level does have some questionable decision making that went into it for sure. The first thing you'll notice are the scaled checkpoints. This used to be a thing creators would do before the force fields were introduced, if they wanted to hide checkpoints for whatever reason. Playing the level today, it gets quite busy because of this. I'll be turning the force fields off for the rest of the review so you don't have to look at all that. Otherwise, it just feels unnecessary, since 2 of the 4 checkpoints aren't even scaled like this anyways. If you use normal checkpoints, why would you even scale these ones? Despite that odd choice, the level's gameplay is okay, although very repetitive. It consists only of doing the same transition 6 times and then you finish. Fun to optimize maybe, but otherwise nothing super interesting. But okay, let's get to the real review. This level is 4,000 pieces. Somehow. From my knowledge of building with optimization in mind, to me this should be around 2,000 pieces max. What specifically makes this 4,000 pieces, you may ask? Well, just a lack of care for piece count, really. I went through the unfortunate process of checking the piece counts on things. But, for example, this entirely flat roof to the parking garage that is mostly covered by terrain and you don't even drive on is made up of half-road pieces. Why? There's even some that are scaled further down, so clearly scaling was something at the creator's disposal. But this isn't even a problem with scaling. There are large flat pieces that could cover this super easily with the vanilla game. If you're wondering, just this parking garage takes up 309 pieces. And I purposely avoid accounting the overly complicated blueprints, which are also a substantial factor to the level's object count. To me, this parking garage should be no more than like 100 pieces, with or without scaling, and that's my maximum. But let's take a look at some other stuff. For example, there are 111 lights. Most buildings contain 1 or 2, but for some reason this burger joint has 9. All the lights are also extremely scaled down, most of the time aren't even seen while driving, and a surprising amount are just floating in the air, and I don't even know why. 133 of the objects are just Zape guys. Maybe this isn't a fun fact, but it is a lot of Zape guys. I would have counted more, but I'm tired now, and lazy. There's a lot more though. So many pieces are overlapping, placed inside of each other, entirely covered by other objects. I could go on. Is this the most unoptimized level I've ever seen? Maybe not, but it's up there. Overall, this track is definitely something. I don't find the gameplay very fun, and the amount of frames I lose playing this track just worsens it. If my PC, which usually stays between 200 to 300 FPS, goes below 60 on this track, I can't see a lot of other players faring well against the frame rate. If your goal is to make tracks other people will want to play, please take the care to optimize it and don't do something like this. And thank you for watching this episode of Zeepkist Map Reviews. If you want your Zeepkist maps to be reviewed in a future video, join the Discord linked in the description below. It's the only way we take submissions. Plus, if you opt in, you'll be notified every time a new episode is published. We only make these every 2 weeks, so they can be easy to miss. Now get out there and make some Zeepkist maps.